Ladies and gentlemen, Ralph Nader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gowley. And thank the groups in California and New York for making this, this possible. And I understand they're going to Boston tomorrow. I want to thank the former Prime Minister of Japan, Mr. Naoto Kan, for coming here. And I hope that he will tour the world in order to radiate the lessons of Fukushima in a benign manner in order to stop the expansion of atomic energy, which is now moving heavily via its promoters into the developing world, where the safeguards, unfortunately, are even lower. And to Dr. Gregory Jasko, I can only say that Senator Markey would be proud of you. Arnie Gunderson represents the best in engineering, which is to foresee and forestall. And Peter Bradford, when Peter was with us right out of law school, I told an associate, you're looking at the next governor of Maine some years hence. But our rancid political system has a brilliantly effective way of driving out good public figures and replacing them with rascals. Now, I don't want to be redundant, and I know a lot of good material has been presented today, but I do want to go through some of the experience here so we can understand what's behind the pressure historically for nuclear power. In 1963, I spent a summer at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, where I was first introduced to nuclear power to produce electricity. And the place was full of engineers and physicists who kept handing my questions between each other, specialties. And I asked them, what's the worst that could happen? I always approached any new technology with that fundamental question. What's the worst that could happen? And they could never tell me. All they could tell me were the risks were vanishingly small and the defenses in depth were formidable. Those were the jargons of the time. What was interesting about that in the mid-60s is that the projection for nuclear power was extremely ambitious. The Atomic Energy Commission predicted that there would be 100 nuclear plants in California alone by the year 2000. That's about one for every 11 miles on the coastline. But what happened in the meantime was two interesting developments. One, we held mass training exercises in 1973-74 in Washington, D.C., where people from all over the country, near existing plants or proposed nuclear plants, came to learn about this industry, learn about how they could participate at the design stage and the construction stage, to learn about evacuation plans, to learn about what they were never taught in school and never told by newspapers, never informed about just how much radioactivity is in a 1,000-megawatt plant, which is hundreds of times more than the radioactivity from the Hiroshima bomb. Those people went back home and they organized the resistance to nuclear power. There hasn't been a single nuclear plant ordered, licensed, and placed in operation to produce electricity since the mid-70s. The analog to that effort was Wall Street. Nuclear power increasingly became uneconomic, and Wall Street would not fund it without more and more government supports and guarantees. Nuclear power arose out of a group of scientists and engineers who harbored more than a reasonable guilt complex for the uses of their knowledge in producing the atomic bomb. And out of World War II, this guilt complex transferred to a hope that there would be atoms for peace. In 1952, President Truman's Materials Policy Committee issued a report saying that the country should go solar, and by 1975, 2/3 of all residences would be solarized. Unfortunately, 2 years later, under President Eisenhower, the country decided to go nuclear under the Atoms for Peace program. Some of our most brilliant scientists and engineers were behind that effort, coming out of the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which were deliberate targeting of civilians, to use the military's phrase in World War II, in order to, quote, terrorize the population and reduce the morale in the countries that attacked us. Just think of that. To terrorize the population. That's where that guilt complex came from. And there were many, many discussions privately between these scientists and engineers who came out of the Manhattan Project about how they could redeem themselves in the Atoms for Peace. I remember as a youngster being told that there would be a little bit of a atomized gadget in cars, and you'd never have to fill up your cars with gasoline. Nuclear power was told to be too cheap to meter by a government official. When I was at Oak Ridge, I had a conversation with Dr. Alvin Weinberg, which extended in subsequent years. Dr. Weinberg was a great promoter of nuclear power, but he's extremely knowledgeable about its hazards. He wanted nuclear power plants to be built 6 at a time in a highly barricaded location run by what he called a nuclear priesthood, namely the best and the brightest. When I asked him who would be running the railroads and the trucking companies transporting radioactive waste, he got the message. But later on, he told me something very interesting. He said, if solar power ever came down to being only 2.5 times more expensive than atomic energy, he would support solar energy over atomic energy. You can imagine the knowledge of risk that was behind that statement. We must remember one thing here. The uranium mines, the uranium radioactive tailings around those mines, the development of the fuel rods, the transportation to the location where the nuclear plant is, the creation of these nuclear plants with enormous complexities, the production of radioactive waste, which still do not have a permanent waste disposal, and all the problems appurtenant to a deadly substance that had to be 100% controlled. 99% is not enough. It was a technology that had one bite of the apple. All of this and the storage for tens of thousands of years of radioactive waste had one purpose: to boil water, to produce steam, or other reactor designs to produce heat. Now, the question that was very rarely asked in secret congressional hearings was, aren't there other ways to boil water without all the continuum of risk involved in the nuclear fuel cycle? It's often said that nuclear power is needed because of the climate change. Number one, you need a lot of coal to burn to enrich the uranium. That's often not mentioned. Number two, as Amory Lovins has said repeatedly, if you take the investment in nuclear and put it in solar, renewable, other forms of renewable and conservation, you'd get far more BTUs, far more efficiently, far more safely, and far more benignly for climate change. We must remember that the price we pay for nuclear power up front, we pay as consumers and as taxpayers. Tens of billions of dollars have gone into developing the science, the technology, the operating applications of nuclear power paid by you, the taxpayers. That does not show up on your electric bill. We're dealing here with a silent, cumulative form of violence that does not leave empirically sensitive traces until it's too late. Therefore, it puts the public off guard. In comparison with a fire, we know what to do. We flee the fire and or try to put it out. The silent violence of radioactivity does not provoke the sensory responses in order to activate better choices. I find that the arguments against nuclear power are overwhelming. The answer is we've never had a Class 9 meltdown in the United States. You had a very serious one in Chernobyl, where now there are hundreds of square kilometers uninhabitable, except for the wild animals and the rodents and a few birds. Villages and towns evacuated. You have Fukushima, which continues to boil up its tragic results. In our country, we had a number of close calls inviting the metaphor of playing Russian roulette with the American people and the land of our country. In the 1960s, the Atomic Energy Commission issued a report which said that a Class 9 meltdown in one nuclear plant could contaminate, quote, an area the size of Pennsylvania, end quote. Is this the kind of gamble we want to take in order to boil water when there are so many other superior ways to meet our energy needs, as Peter Bradford and others earlier today have pointed out? My list of charges against nuclear power, all of them begin with the letter U. Nuclear power is unnecessary, uneconomic, unsafe, uninsurable, unevacuable, unfinanceable, unaccountable, and undemocratic. It's unnecessary because it is not a matter of nuclear power or coal. It's a matter of nuclear power or the horrendously wonderful opportunities for conservation. We waste well over half of our energy in the United States, even by comparison with Western Europe. By comparison with realizable, practical technology, we probably waste over 2/3. A megawatt you do not waste is a megawatt you do not have to produce. We must never forget that the fastest, quickest, cleanest, most efficient, most job-intensive, most decentralized form of energy today is not to waste it. Whether it's retrofitting buildings, motor vehicles, lighting, heating, air conditioning, industrial engines, and so on. The other alternatives are clear. Finally, solar is coming into its own. Wind power is creating more BTUs worldwide now than nuclear. And we are seeing a fast-rising local industry called rooftop solar installation, led by many, many jobs being created in California and spreading around the country. Nuclear power is uneconomic because, first of all, we pay for it in many ways beyond just the electricity bill. We pay for it, as I said, with tax dollars. We pay for it in many other collateral ways that an economy has to adjust to such a dangerous industry. National security ways, for example. It's uneconomic by the admission of the industry itself. As Peter Bradford pointed out, you're beginning to see cancellations of the recent new proposals to build nuclear plants, Florida being one. Georgia may not be far away. But in both those states, consumers were required to pay up front for the cost of the nuclear plant before a shovel hit the ground. I'll get to that in a moment. It's uneconomic because Wall Street says it's uneconomic. Warren Buffett says nuclear power is uneconomical. Wall Street will not lend utilities money to build a nuclear plant without just about 100% loan guarantee from Uncle Sam, you the taxpayer. Nuclear power cannot meet market tests. This has always intrigued me why the Tea Party right-wing free market Milton Friedman types would not come out against nuclear power. Because it's basically government-guaranteed industry. One reason, of course, is the political and economic power of a government-guaranteed industry, funneling big money to politicians and, in effect, convincing those who need convincing on other than rational grounds that there's no alternative to nuclear power. It's unsafe. It's unsafe because of earthquakes, because of human error, because of malfunctioning equipment, because of sabotage. Every nuclear plant is a national security peril. It's unsafe because there's no place acceptable by the local population to store the waste, low-level waste, high-level waste. Spent fuel rods are piling up next to nuclear power plants. It's a clear target for sabotage, if not seismic exposure. It's uninsurable from the beginning. The government had to pass the Price-Anderson Act, which in effect said that the insurance companies would not insure nuclear power. Therefore, apart from a fractional bit of insurance, the great bulk of economic risk from a nuclear power accident would be on the taxpayer's back. That's the meaning of Price-Anderson, which is renewed every decade or so. It's unevacuable, and this comes to Indian Point. Any nuclear plant that does not have a live drill to make sure that its evacuation plan is anything other than a fantasy plan cannot be allowed to operate. Indian Point is 30 miles or so north of Manhattan, much closer to New York City than Fukushima is to Tokyo. There is no practical evacuation plan that could work in that area. Not just 10 miles out, 20, 30 miles, 50 miles, you have 19 million people. People can hardly get out of New York City at rush hour time. Can anybody credibly present a scenario where, given our transportation lockups and the density of population and the panic that would occur and the lack of any drills, the lack of any practice other than paper models, that area around Indian Point can be evacuated? And as you know, Indian Point has been rife with problems, replete with waivers, near active earthquake zones, aging, decaying. Indian Point 1 shut down years ago. Indian Point 2 and 3 up for recertification by a compliant Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Nuclear power is unfinanceable. I've gone through that. It doesn't meet a market test. It is basically a government-sanctioned and funded industry. Nuclear power is really unregulatable. There are good people at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. 2 of them are sitting here. They harbor their doubts. I saw the eyes of Chairman Jasko when I asked him, would he favor a real-life evacuation drill around Indian Point? And I think you told me that's not practical. But I don't think you believed it.
I still think it's unpractical.
Yes, it may be unpractical. Depends on what you mean by that, huh? In fact, that's the answer, isn't it? It couldn't happen because you couldn't evacuate people. But the NRC, being the heir to the Atomic Energy Commission, inherited some of its deficiencies. One is, it still has a promotional attitude, even though it was split to be regulatory agency and Department of Energy, supposed to be the promotional, when the Atomic Energy Commission that preceded it had both, which is rather a conflict of missions. We must remember that an unregulable industry, under the guise of regulation, lulls people into a false sense of security. But regularly, the Union of Concerned Scientists and others get inside memorandums and reports, or the NRC releases reports that show a rather terribly dismaying picture of these aging, corroding nuclear plants. Remember, we almost had a disaster several decades ago at Browns Ferry when a repair person was looking for something in the under cable area of the plant with a candle. The candle started a fire with the polyurethane foam spreading through the cables. This is a giant nuclear plant. The emergency crews came. They tried every high-tech way to put out the fire until the bystanding local fire chief suggested water. And they put it out with an old technique known as H2O. There was the near disaster at Fermi in Michigan, which prompted the outcry by one of the people there afterwards saying, quote, "We almost lost Detroit," end quote. There was 3 Mile Island. There was Davis-Besse not that many years ago, less than an inch of a critical piece of metal corroding, kept it from being a serious accident. How many times do we have to play Russian roulette? Above all, it's an undemocratic technology. It was born in secrecy. It grew to prevalence in secrecy. It had severe restrictions on local participation in the design and construction stage. In recent years, the restrictions were even more pronounced. Now you just have one avenue of challenge. They combined the two. The industry working overtime to keep the people out, to shut them out from the process of putting a plant where they live, work, and raise their children. This is an inherently coercive technology promoted by a secular religion, nuclearism. It's coercive of taxpayers who are forced to guarantee the plants. It's coercive of ratepayers who are forced to front load the cost of the plants. And it's coercive of the citizenry who have very little voice in foreseeing and forestalling a calamity. Let me just end on this note. While we have to be very concerned about atomic energy in our country, as the orders dry up in the developed nations, the industry's sales people are pushing into countries that are developing rapidly but have less of an infrastructure and thereby a much higher risk of disaster. Even in the United Arab Emirates, where the sunlight is unsurpassed, where there is oil and gas all around, the country has cut a deal with a South Korean firm, $40 billion deal for multiple power plants. This company is subcontracting to US and European contractors. And the United Arab Emirates is the size of Maine. That's not a very stable area of the world. They're being built in India. Already, radioactive waste has been dumped into the ocean for years. The safeguards are not anywhere near what they should be in those densely populated areas. So the cause of stopping nuclear power for all these and other reasons is a great one, because in its place it will usher in the future forms of energy for the planet Earth, which are renewable, all forms of solar energy, and energy efficiency at a level that engineers have been telling us is possible, practical, cost-effective for many, many years. And we haven't been sufficiently listening, although there have been significant advances in energy conservation. Now, I have a local plea for people in the New York City area. You have on record Hillary Clinton, Eliot Spitzer, Andrew Cuomo coming down against relicensing Indian Point. Build on that. Increasingly support the citizen groups around Indian Point, many of whom are here today, in order to shut that dual nuclear power plant installation down and replace it with energy efficiency. And for transition, almost anything is better than nuclear, whether it's water power from Canada, whether it's reshifting capacity it's not fully used in the rest of the state down to the New York City area, or even a fossil fuel as a transition. Some of you may have seen that movie, On the Beach, which dealt with the effects of a nuclear bomb. There needs to be another movie. It's called On the Hudson, Indian Point. The way to arouse people around Indian Point is to repeatedly demand a real-life drill for the evacuation plan they're supposed to be putting in your local libraries and making public. And not just 10 miles around where there may be 280,000 people, but go out 20 or 30. I believe it was Chairman Jasko who recommended that Americans evacuate 50 miles away from Fukushima. 50 miles means over 18 million people. And I have one more plea. Find a very rich person, whether it's a billionaire or a mega millionaire, and I understand there are quite a few of them in the New York City area. Sit down with those people, one at a time. Show them the kind of materials, the presentations that you've seen today. Give them a sense of posterity. Give them an opportunity to move from their success to their significance, and have them fund a major mobilization of the greater New York City area to shut down Indian Point and begin rolling back nuclear power throughout the country. So you can meet the people who, in California, who are rolling it back out of that state. The great point about this meeting and others is that you see people who were once viewing nuclear power as promising. But as Alfred North Whitehead said, they kept in their mind options open for revision. We haven't seen enough scientists in the nuclear industry who can keep, quote, options open for revision, end quote. Although there have been a number of Nobel laureates like Henry Kendall and Alfvén from Sweden who did keep options open for revision and oppose nuclear power. But that's what we have to ask for. More people out of the industry, out of the NRC, out of the Department of Energy, basically saying there's a better way, there's a safer way, there's a more environmentally benign way, there's a more respectful way for the land and for our descendants, if only to keep our descendants from cursing us. Thank you.